We are going to kick this off with some announcements. So hello, everyone. And as more people continue to join us, welcome to the 12th session of EAMC at Home, as we talk about S.O.G.I.E and allyship, building a culture of LGBTQ inclusion with Human Rights Campaign Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Nicole Cozier. If you don't know me, my name is Kate Bean, and I will be one of your moderators for today's session. And it is my esteemed pleasure to introduce my co-host for today, Samuel Guerrero.
As Kate mentioned, this is our 12th session of EAMC at Home. And if this is your first one or you missed an earlier session, no problem. All sessions are free and we record each of them and add them to our website at eventarenamarketing.com, as well as upload to our EAMC Facebook page. So be sure to check these out to rewatch any previous sessions, as well as share with any friends or coworkers that you think may be interested.
We are excited to continue to promote the EAMC podcast titled Adventures in Venue Land. Co-hosted by Dave Rettelberger and Paul Hooper, the podcast consists of interviews with guests who work in the live entertainment industry, as well as bonus episodes featuring case studies of unique situations and events happening right now. You can find Adventures in Venue Land on any podcast service, such as Apple, Spotify, Google, or you can listen through your browser on the EAMC website.
Don't forget to submit your nominations for the new EAMC Impact Award. This award was recently established to recognize an individual who's making a change for good in their community or within the entertainment community, regardless of whether it is through their employer or on a personal level. In the words of John Lewis, we encourage all of you to go out and get into good trouble. Whether it is fighting for social justice, feeding the hungry, helping the disabled, influencing a diverse hiring process, or any other great cause, we all need to make an impact. Nominations are open through the end of March and self-nominations are welcome. Submit yourself or someone you may know by going to eventarenamarketing.com/impact.
And lastly, our next EAMC Mixer will be on March 18th, almost a year to the day of when we all started working from home. Join us in marking the occasion, licking our wounds together, and having some lighthearted fun as we finally start to see some light at the end of the tunnel for this industry.
During today's sessions, if you have any questions or comments, there are two ways to participate. First, by using the raise hand function located at the bottom of your Zoom reactions toolbar. And the second method, should you wish to have a moderator read your question, is to directly message one of us, and we'll be happy to share your question with the speaker anonymously.
Now, without further ado, it is our pleasure to introduce the speaker for today's session.
She is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Human Rights Campaign, a nonprofit organization whose mission of equality for all, not for some, envisions a world where every member of the LGBTQ family has the freedom to live their truth without fear and with equity under the law.
As we continue the uncomfortable conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the entertainment marketing industry, we gain inspiration from Audre Lorde's quote, shared by our speaker. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives.
It is through this lens we encourage you all to actively listen and engage with today's speaker.
Please join us in welcoming Nicole Cozier.
Hi,
Nicole,
everyone.
welcome. Thank you for joining us.
I like to make an entrance, so bear with me. I want to get my shared screen up. All right, can everyone see my screen? Awesome. Well, thank you, Kate. Thank you, Samuel. Thank you to everyone on the EAMC team for inviting me to be a speaker at this program today. I am thrilled to be here. As Kate mentioned, my name is Nicole Cozier. I'm the Senior Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Human Rights Campaign, and I use she, her pronouns. And I know that you are dropping your names and pronouns in the chat. If this is a new practice for you, I hope you will understand why we're doing this by the end of the conversation today. But I am really excited to have this conversation with you because diversity, equity, and inclusion work is my passion. It's something that I'm driven to do professionally, but it is also a deep personal passion and commitment of mine because it's not just about the work. There are lives at the at the core of this work, it's about how we change the quality and experience of our lives and the lives of each other. Now, I know in the past that whenever we get into these things, despite that very real and visceral way that we experience our lives and our identities, the reality is, you know, a lot of these sessions end up being very sort of intellectualized and kind of for the most part. So let's just get started. Let's delve into a moment of truth. Can you just drop a 1 in the chat if you've ever been to one of a DEI training or some session that you just sort of went in and like, what are all of the things that I could be doing with my time right now other than being here? It's okay, you won't hurt my feelings. Just drop a 1 in the chat. I'm not seeing anything. Does that mean nobody has ever felt that way? Well, if that is not the case, and I don't know if perhaps I'm not seeing all of that, it's the 1 is just drop a 1 in the chat if you have ever been to some sort of diversity training that you had a little bit of eye roll moment as you were going in the room. Okay, there we go. There's some honesty. Okay, well, I hope that this is not going to be one of those, but I just want to acknowledge and I want to apologize on behalf of the experiences you had coming in here. But I really don't want this to be something that is dry. We've really tried to make it engaging and interactive and really practical. And so I'm looking forward to your questions, but let's get started so we can get through all the content. So I usually start my sessions with some sort of group agreement or community sort of ground rules or just a way of being in the space together. But I'm going to do this in a little bit differently today. The first thing is I just want us to have a real acknowledgement that this is an hour and a half that we have together. This is not going to be all you ever needed to know to create LGBTQ plus inclusion, right? This is a step in a longer journey. For some of you, you are coming in right in the beginning. This is just something real new that you're just trying to get your feet wet in. For some of you, you are living in this space every day, right? So this is not anything new. And for most of us, we're somewhere in between, and that's okay. My goal is for everybody to get something out of the session today and be able to connect with each other in a way. But you really need to remember as we go through this that we're not going to learn all we need to know about the complexity of our lives and others in an instant. We have learned and gained the knowledge we have over a lifetime. It's going to take some time to unlearn that. And if anybody has a type A personality, your immediate thing is like, yes, but what do I do? Give me the list. I want to know the action plan. And I just invite you to kind of take a breath, lean in. Some of this is going to be actionable. Some of this will be introspective. But if you are uncomfortable, that's okay. That's part of the journey. The other thing that I'm going to really ask you to do is engage with humility. And what I mean by that is we need to recognize our own limitations. We need to challenge our worldviews. We need to stay open to learning and unlearning, and we need to let go of the need to have all of the answers. All right. I know that's a hard task for many of us, me included, but it's really essential as we're doing this work. The last thing that I want to dispel before we get started is this myth of the LGBTQ monolith. Okay, I call it the LGBTQ umbrella, right? Like it's one big word. We all have the same experience and the same identities and the same. Our LGBTQ experience is as varied as it can be. And what makes it that way is that our LGBTQ experience is really shaped by the intersections of all of the other identities we have. That's why that Audre Lorde quote is so relevant. We don't live single issue lives. So my experience as a Black, queer, lesbian, immigrant, you know, all of those things are influence, which make my experience very different than somebody else's who might be under the LGBTQ umbrella as well. So what we're talking about over the course of this conversation are some generalities, but if one of the things that I want you to take away is if you've met one LGBTQ person, you've met one LGBTQ person, please don't generalize. Please don't ask us to represent our entire community, but do take the time to get to know all of the beautiful nuances that make each of us unique. But know that we do have obviously some broad political aspirations, equality, belonging, being able to live authentically. And those are the things that really connect us. Okay. So we're going to start in literally what is going to be a crash course in LGBTQ terminology, right? And for those of you who looked at the session, and if you were like, S.O.G.I.E, what the heck is S.O.G.I.E? Well, I'm about to tell you. So S.O.G.I.E is an umbrella term that actually stands for, it's an acronym for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And we're going to go through and I'm going to explain each one of these terms and then add one more as a bonus. So sexual orientation, very simply, is who a person is attracted to, okay? Who a person is attracted to. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of gender. Gender expression is how a person chooses to communicate or express their gender outwardly. And sex assigned at birth is the classification people are given at birth, usually based on the state of their genitals, okay? So we have these four varied things that are often conflated, and we think that one means something about the other. Because really, the way we've been socialized, sex assigned at birth means, okay, we'll check this box, this is the sex you're assigned at birth, and this is what it means about who you love, what you look like, how you show up in the world, the characteristics we assign to you, etc. And that's just not the way that people work. So, of all of these four, ironically, the only thing that we do not have control over is the one that actually probably defines the trajectory of our lives most imminently, which is the sex assigned at birth. But we do have the ability to name and define our sexual orientation, our gender identity, and our gender expression. And that's really important. And that's why we're really working to shift away from the importance of sex assigned at birth as some sort of determining factor for who people are and how their lives unfold. There's a great resource by this organization called TSER, the Transgender Students Education Resource, and we have been trying to find different pithy ways of sort of representing this interconnection between gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and sex assigned at birth. And it's not simple because it's not a simple relationship. But the thing that I want you to take away most is that gender identity is how we perceive ourselves in our minds and how we feel I feel about who we are internally. Gender expression is how we express ourselves externally. Sexual orientation is about our heart, who we love, and who we're attracted to. And then sex is just about our genitals, right? And that's probably the least important thing about us and the least interesting. But we cannot conflate these things and assume because we know or observe something about our gender identity that it means something about any of those other things, right? These are distinct elements of our identity, and they combine in all sorts of ways to make us who we are. Also, we don't exist on a spectrum. And I'm going to get to that in a moment when we talk about the binary. So, as you get to know the community, there are lots of different ways that we define this umbrella. LGBTQ+, LGBTQIA. We call it the alphabet soup. It's a bit of a joke, but it isn't at the same time, right? Because the reason this exists like this is because we're really trying to find ways to allow people to represent themselves in their authenticity. And if there was not a world with oppression where we had to define ourselves, we wouldn't need all of these labels, right? But the point of these labels is so that we have a sense of community and a sense of political presence so that we can advance sort of the work that we need to do around our equality. But that's different than sort of who we are and how we need to show up every single day. So when you look at this acronym, LGBTQ, I want you to realize that the L, the G, and the B, and to some extent the Q is about sexual orientation, and the T, and to some extent the Q, is about gender identity. So even within this acronym, we're bringing in multiple facets of our identities, okay? It's not one single thing. So the L, most simply, is women who emotionally are attracted or sexually attracted to other women. G is a person who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of the same gender. G is a term, while lesbian is a word that has generally been used, by female identified or non-binary folks, depending on their identity, and we'll go into some of that terminology later. Gay has been used as a catch-all term. You've seen women identified folks use the word gay, as well as male identified folks. It's been a bit of a catch-all. And then B, which is the one I really want you to focus in on, because this is one where people sort of have a lot of misconceptions, are people who are emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to people of more than one gender, not necessarily at the same time, not necessarily in the same way, and not necessarily to the same degree. It is important to realize that bisexual identity is an identity. It is not a step along the way from straightness to gayness. It is not confusion. It is not being on the fence. It is a defined identity. And actually, the LGBTQ community, plus community, is comprised of over 50% of our community is bi-identified. So it's really important that we understand the importance of that. The Q, we're going to skip the T because we're going to come back to it. The Q is a term used to express a spectrum of both identities and orientations that are counter to the mainstream, right? The Q has been sort of that, the not mainstream, the other. The history of the Q is challenging. So I would just advise that you don't actually refer to someone as queer because it has been used in disparaging ways, but has been reclaimed by members of the community, and particularly as you look to younger generations who don't want to necessarily feel stuck in some of these other identity boxes. Q has been used as a really open term to define their identities, but don't use that for someone unless they identify it that way, because you really don't know what someone's association with that language is. And then finally, the plus is just because our community is evolving and expanding, and there are a number of ways that people identify that aren't part of this, right? You may have heard of terms pansexual, asexual, two-spirit, which is a very particular cultural manifestation of gender identity and tied to a religious context within Indigenous communities. But there are a lot of ways that people define themselves, their gender identity and their sexual orientation that we can't fully capture. So it really is a very diverse group. So I want to get back to the T. And so we often talk about the T, the trans meaning transgender, but we don't necessarily talk about sort of what is not T, right? Which is the cisgender. So I just want to bring both of these together as the same concept, because folks may be hearing the word cisgender more and more. So these prefixes are really from the Latin. So cis means across, on the same side of, and trans means across from. And when we think about these terms, we're really talking about it as it relates to the sex assigned at birth. So cisgender people are people whose gender identity aligns with the sex assigned to them at birth. And transgender people are a more, again, bigger, broader umbrella, but of folks whose gender identity or gender expression is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth, okay? And then within that transgender umbrella, there are lots of different ways that that looks. I also want to, at this point, talk about the gender binary. The gender binary you have been engaged with your entire lives without even knowing that it was called the gender binary, probably. But it really is a system that allocates us into two distinct and opposite forms of, masculine and feminine, male, female. But there is an expression, a gender identity that is not based on the binary, and that's called non-binary identity. And that non-binary identity for people who don't necessarily identify exclusively as male or female. And they may not actually, they may identify as a combination of both, something altogether different. Sometimes it changes depending on sort of how they're feeling in the moment. But it's really important that we, again, understand and respect these identities as not just being phases or confusion, but these really are valid ways that people feel and show up in the world. So some other ways that people identify that may not be on the gender binary are non-binary, sometimes called NB, gender queer, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, and gender expansive. And the term gender expansive may be used more among youth. And these terms generally vary widely by generation and geographic region. So depending on where you go, different terminology might be more popular. But it's also important to realize that, as I said, each of these things is distinct from one another, that people with non-binary identities can identify as cisgender or transgender. And it's not for us to tell people, oh, you're non-binary, so you must be transgender. If somebody does not identify themselves as transgender, don't make that assumption or assignment for them. Okay, I want to apologize because I can't see the chat where I am, so I'm going to rely on Kate. If there's anything that I need to stop to address in the moment, I'm going to ask you to flag it for me.
So Nicole, I think this is a great opportunity for that. Thank you. What I have gotten is, can you expand a little bit for us on the difference in the use of the word queer versus genderqueer?
Yes. So queer, as I mentioned, is more of it's a broader kind of reaching terminology that can refer to either gender identity or sexual orientation. I, for example, am increasingly using the term queer to define my my sexual orientation. For me, and I use that very carefully, for me, it's because the term lesbian feels a little bit, it just doesn't feel like it fully fits, even though I partner with women exclusively, but queer feels a little bit more reflective of my identity. So that's an example of how queer can be used to define someone's sexual orientation. But my manifestation of queer identity may look very different than somebody else's manifestation of queer identity. When we're talking about genderqueer, that really relates to gender identity. And I use queer to define my sexual orientation, but for my gender identity, I still identify as a cisgender woman, right? That's my gender identity. For someone else, genderqueer means that they don't identify on that binary, right? They're not going to identify as male or female. Their way of defining their gender outside of those boxes is defined by genderqueer. I hope that makes sense.
Great, thank you.
So much, and I'll keep going until you flag me, Kate. But when we think then about the binary and we're like, okay, well, we know if we're male identified, we use she, her pronouns. I mean, female identified, we use she, her pronouns. And if we're male identified, we often use he, him pronouns. But what do we use when somebody doesn't identify as those things? And gender pronouns are something that most people take for granted because it is part of that, the unfolding list of boxes that you're assigned a certain sex at birth. That comes with certain pronouns, and those pronouns are used in place of your name. And if you're female identified, those are she, her. And if you're male identified, those are he, him. But the reality is that gender pronouns are more and more part of a manifestation of how people feel and their gender identity, right? It's not about just that box. It's based on our gender identity. So we choose pronouns that feel like they represent our gender identity. I use she, her pronouns. They reflect my gender identity. For non-binary folks may use they, them pronouns. And there's actually a whole host of non-binary pronouns. But they, them pronouns are the most popular ones that we use in the United States. But depending on where you go, you might hear things like Z and Zer and A and air. So there are a lot of different ways that can look. But the most important thing is that we have to step away from this notion that when we look at someone, we can make determinations about who they are and how we refer to them based on what we see and what their gender expression is, right? So it's really important. The reason we asked you to put your pronouns in the chat is because when we assume somebody's pronouns, we may get it right, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was a good idea to assume. More importantly, the sign of respect that we're lending is that we ask people what pronouns they use. And we don't do that by saying, oh, I cannot figure out what pronouns you use. What pronouns do you use? But we do that by introducing ourselves and using our pronouns, and that creates a space and an invitation to somebody else for sharing their pronouns. Or even if you ask someone first, you make sure to offer your pronouns up right away, as opposed to being like, oh, well, it's obvious what my pronouns are, so I don't need to share those. When we don't
So Nicole.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
I'm going to hop in with another question about pronouns as we're talking about this. So it's been very popular lately for people to begin using pronouns, as we've done in their email signature. Can you talk a little bit about why that has started, and kind of also expand upon whether or not it can also be confusing to understanding whether or not someone is identifying as being LGBTQ?
Okay, so the one thing I want to say before we get to that question is people may also use more than one pronoun, right? You might see that somebody says, I use she, her, or they, them pronouns, right? And in which case you might follow up with, do you have a preference? Is there one that you prefer me to use more than the other? And if the person says, no, I'm fine with either one, then you can use either one. But that the other sort of takeaway is, don't assume that somebody only can use one set of pronouns and you have to commit to one set of pronouns and that's it. So the reason we've been using pronouns in our emails more often is it creates sort of a sense of inclusion and an open door to people to say, you know what, I am not making any assumptions about that you will know my pronouns, and I am welcoming and inviting you to tell me what pronouns to use for you. That's sort of the underlying message in the pronouns, in naming the pronouns in our email. Because we need to create more and more spaces of safety and inclusion and sort of send up those signs that this is a safe and welcoming environment and that we are not making assumptions about who you are or how you identify. To the point of the question of, would it not be confusing? We all have pronouns and we all have the ability and the right to define those pronouns. You don't have to be LGBTQ identified. And so just as we don't want to make assumptions by, if we see somebody that we're assuming what we see is a reflection of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, we don't make assumptions about pronouns. And if we were all actually sharing our pronouns, it wouldn't feel so othering, right? It wouldn't just be the people who are part of the LGBTQ community who need to identify their pronouns. And in fact, the feeling that, well, it should be obvious what my pronouns are, I don't have to proclaim them, is actually a manifestation of our privilege as cisgender people with a gender expression that is accepted, right? So it's really important that we think about what are the messages that we're communicating and how we can model the kind of inclusion that we want to see. When we use the wrong pronouns for someone, it's called a term that's often referred to as misgendering. We use incorrect pronouns. And it's going to happen, right? Because we don't always know. And as much as we don't want to assume, it happens as part of the default process. So the important thing is not necessarily being like, oh, geez, I can't say anything, I can't do anything because I don't want to make a mistake. But it's really important that we do our best to do our pre-work. How are we inviting and doing our homework to find out what pronouns someone uses? And then if we do make a mistake, that we correct it and not make it the other person's responsibility to make us feel better about making a mistake about their pronouns. Because the thing about pronouns and misgendering is that there is a cumulative impact of that. And so while for folks for whom our gender pronouns and our gender identity are usually assumed rightly, and we don't often experience misgendering, that's part of our privilege. For folks who experience that time and time again, it's really wearing. Imagine if you know somebody and they keep calling you by the wrong name over and over and over again, right? The first time you're like, oh, cool, that's not my name, here's my name. But after a certain point, it feels like you're invisible. It feels like something's not getting through. It feels like the person is not caring to know and respect you. At the end of the day, this is about respect. Okay. So that's the kind of giant landscape. And I know I threw a lot of information at you. We'll send you the slides after, so please don't worry about that. But I wanted you to have some foundation. I want to talk a little bit about coming out, and I use those terms in quotes. because coming out really refers to, when we use coming out, it refers generally to the sense of revealing or disclosing our sexual orientation or gender identity. The challenge with the term coming out is it means sort of like we're hidden until we do this like disclosure process. And people all have all sorts of sort of assumptions and meaning tied to that process. And so I want to talk a little bit about this because when you're in big companies or big settings, you may not have the same level of interpersonal connection with folks, and coming out may be something that you're going to come across time and time again. But one of the things I want you to, and we'll talk about 6 things around this, but each coming out story or experience is unique, right? We cannot assume that a coming out experience is challenging and fraught and hard. We cannot assume that a coming out experience is beautiful and affirming and welcoming. And while I hope that people's experiences with coming out, they're meeting more affirming, having more affirming experiences as we get more comfortable, we get more exposed, we get more educated about LGBTQ identity. That experience looks really different for people, again, based on all of those intersecting identities. The experience of coming out in your sexual orientation is also not the same as the experience of coming out in your gender identity. And somebody may be going through both of those processes at different points in time. We still have a highly discriminating and transphobic environment. So folks who are coming out in trans and non-binary identities still have a lot of challenges, as are people who are still coming out in LGBTQ identities as well. It's really important to notice that this is a personal decision. It's not an obligation. Your LGBTQ colleagues are not, they don't owe you the knowledge of knowing what their sexual orientation or gender identity is. Just like we don't owe anybody else the right to access any other part of our life story, we get to make that decision. And because somebody is not actively kind of having this sort of disclosure process, it doesn't mean they're hiding, right? We can be out in other spaces and choose not to talk about things in certain settings. It is part of our personal decision and personal choice. It is also important to note that because it's a personal decision, it is not your story to share for someone else. So it means that if you know somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity and you don't know if somebody else knows it, it's not your job or your place. You're like, oh, did you hear Jessica? Or did you know Jessica's a lesbian? Even if it's meant in the most positive, affirming way. Let people be in charge of telling their own stories. And we also have to note that coming out is not a single event. It is a lifelong process, right? Every time we come into contact with new people, because we still live in a world that assumes cisgender and heterosexual identity, every time we come into contact with someone, we have to make a decision. LGBTQ identified people have to make a decision about how much we want to share about our sexual orientation or gender identity in that setting. And just because we do choose to share some aspect of our identity, it doesn't mean that it's an open invitation to ask all sorts of questions. And I think that that's changing somewhat now, but I remember first coming out and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, tell me about this or tell me about that. I remember being pregnant and a woman, an older woman's like, so aren't you a lesbian? I said, uh-huh. She's like, well, how does that all work? Right? So the idea that somehow it was my job or responsibility to educate her around how a woman who partners with women can become pregnant. I knew where she was coming from, but it was highly invasive. And think about sort of the questions that you would welcome from other people when you think about the questions that you want to ask others. Curiosity, we're all curious. Whether we act on that curiosity is something altogether different, right? So we have to respect each other's privacy. And then I would say this coming out process is a two-way street, and there's a responsibility that comes with that. And that means that as we come out, or as people feel like they are ready to share or disclose who they are, and I will say one thing real quick, how people come out looks really different, right? I think we should not expect the days when someone comes into a room and says, okay, everybody, please sit down. I have something really important to share with you, right? But the more and more we are living authentically in our LGBTQ identities, the more those coming out instances are just, I've put a picture of me and my partner on my desk. I refer to my wife in a conversation, right? I talk about my spouse. We talk about different things in conversation as opposed to having sort of these sit down, sort of revealing moments. But when I say it's a two-way street, it means that if somebody is trusting you enough to share that aspect of their life with you, you also have a responsibility to hold that with respect. And it doesn't mean, for some folks, there's still a struggle. We're still learning and unlearning the things that we've been taught and understand about sexual orientation and gender identity. But it's important that you do that work separate from your engagement with the person who's coming out to you, because you don't want to put your baggage or your hangups about their identity back on them, right? They've taken the brave and vulnerable step of sharing something very personal and very pivotal of who they are with you, and you need to respect that and hold that. Okay.
Nicole, I do have a question that just got submitted.
Yes.
The question is, how can I support someone who is not out in the workplace without outing them in that same space, but more along the line of how do we make it more of an inviting space to come out?
Right. So I think that's a really good point, because sometimes people are just personal, are private people, and they're not going to share elements of their personal life. But a lot of times when people aren't willing to share or disclose or talk openly about who they are, it's because they don't feel like it's a welcoming and affirming environment. That's why when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the things that's really important is so much of our paradigm is like, oh, we'll get diverse people in the room and then we'll figure out how to make them feel included, or then we'll figure out, how to involve them and affirm them in the space. And I actually think that's really backwards. We have to be thinking about what is affirming in our space before we bring people into their room. So I think it's really important to think about, how do we talk about LGBTQ identity in our space? How do we respond when we see things? What are the water cooler conversations? How comfortable are we using pronouns? And we have to figure out what we do, not just when people are in the room, but what we do just because that is our culture and who we are. And then people will respond to that. But the problem with what we do when people are in the room is, if that's not consistent, that actually can be harmful in the long run, because we're switching up and then somebody is not in the room and you say something and then they're in the room and you say it differently. And then that's not authentic. That's not authentic inclusion. So I would say, think about what are the things that are affirming and welcoming for LGBTQ people, and do those things. And that person may never actually disclose their identity or sexual orientation in the room. But that doesn't mean we don't stop doing the work in creating the environment.
Nicole, is this a good time for organizations that are looking to create that more inclusive space? Sorry, we received another question about pronoun usage and including it in the email signature. So I'm going to try to tie it into this conversation a little bit better. So for an organization to get ahead of that and start making it a more inclusive and safer space for people to come out, for an individual who may use more than one pronoun where they are being identified and aren't comfortable sharing that, is this possible to enact pronoun sharing as a company policy to potentially make that space safer? Or how would you go about that situation?
Yeah,
I don't know if I asked that super well.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, right? Because we want to create inclusion, and we also don't want to create a space where we're forcing people, particularly folks who may be still exploring or coming to terms with the pronouns that feel authentic to them. We don't want to make people feel sort of obligated to define a set of pronouns that they're not fully ready for, right? So I think rather than mandate, and this is hard, there are just so many debates around this, but I think we have to start thinking about what is the purpose and how we get people to really buy in from a place of authenticity rather than just from a place of mandating. Because if we're saying that this is part of our sort of flag to say, hey, we're a safe space, if in the back of my head, I'm like, I don't get this pronoun stuff, you're he or she, that's it, I don't believe in, anything in between. And I'm like, hey, I'm Nicole, I use she, her pronouns. And I'm putting out that welcome mat. And I actually am not prepared to live into the values and live into the respect that that's saying. I'm really doing a disservice to somebody who sees that and says, oh, it's okay, I'm safe and welcome here, right? So I think that there are a lot of different reasons why people who may be LGBTQ identified or may use different pronouns than are assigned to them, that they may not want to do that. But for folks who are in a place of privilege, which means that, we don't have to think about our pronouns that often because we just have been using the ones that we've been assigned, I would really interrogate, if you're not leaning into that, why isn't it? Not from a mandate place, but from a respect place. What is it that you're not willing to respect? And one of the things that it's going to come up over and over again in this presentation is you do not have to understand or agree to respect, right? I don't have to understand why people use different pronouns or different gender identities. I don't have to agree with it. But if I respect my colleagues, if I'm trying to create a collaborative and collegial and inclusive workspace based on respect, then there are certain practices that are really important to lean into. Okay, so that was actually the place. Speaking, this is a place where I was inviting us to reflect and discuss all of the things that we just talked about. And so we were doing it along the way, which is fantastic. But are there any other sort of burning questions? There's more for us to talk about, but I just wanted to see if there were any other questions relating to terminology, pronouns, coming out.
At this point, the questions that have been submitted have been answered unless someone else has something they would like us to ask. Nicole.
All right, well, don't be shy if it comes up afterwards. Feel free, but we're gonna move on because we got so much to cover. Now, here's my favorite thing to talk about, which is navigating mistakes. So we just talked about all of this terminology, some of which may be new, some of which, is making your head spin, wherever you are in relation to kind of your depth and exposure and comfort with that terminology. The one thing, and there's not a whole lot I can guarantee in life, but the one thing I can guarantee in life is that we are going to make mistakes. I do this for a living, day in and day out, and I still make mistakes. So my mantra is, the mistake itself is less important. It's what we do in response to the mistake, okay? Because Maya Angelou has a great quote, which is, the abbreviated version is, when we know better, we do better, right? And so the more we have to constantly be trying to educate ourselves, and then the more we know, the more it'll influence and the better we can do. But in the meantime, we're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna have stumbles along the way. So mistakes are an essential part of life and growth. We cannot grow without making mistakes. And our response to mistakes is what counts. So I have a few steps and things to help folks navigate mistakes, because hopefully if we know what to do when the mistake happens, it will make us a little less afraid of being open and sort of engaging in things that are not part of our immediate knowledge base or immediate comfort zone. Okay. So look, most of us are at this place where you are trying your best and oops, I just made a mistake. Now what do I do, right? And when mistakes happen, oftentimes, particularly because most of us are not trying to move through the world hurting or harming people, right? We do have good intentions, even though they don't necessarily land the way we want them to. So it's really easy to get very self-focused and I can't believe I made the mistake and that's not what I meant and please don't think I'm a bad person because, and trying to sort of recover your character or your sense of goodness and that you're not being defined by that mistake. But what happens in that process is you center yourself in that, and the person who's been on the other end and potentially harmed by your mistake is sort of left sort of flapping in the wind after an awkward, at best awkward situation, at worst harmful situation, right? So it's really important that when mistakes happen, we work to decenter ourselves. And look, mistakes are uncomfortable. Nobody wants to be wrong. No one likes the knowledge that they've potentially hurt someone. but we have to lean into the discomfort, because when we try to distance ourselves from the discomfort, that's when we start doing all of the stuff that actually can compound the impact of the mistake. We have to prioritize impact over intent. What we mean and what was in our heart is less important than what actually the impact was on the person that we were interacting with, right? It's not that it's not important, but it is less important than the impact. So if I didn't intend to hurt someone, but that person is hurt, I have to focus on how I can make amends to that person who is hurt, rather than trying to convince them that I didn't mean to hurt them, okay? And then this one's really hard. Don't expect forgiveness, not from that person. It's great if you get it and you do all of the things that you do are the right, all of the things you do to try to repair that situation are going to be really important. But if the end result of that process is, okay, so now I've done this, now please forgive me. We don't know what that person's experience is. We don't know how many times they've had to go through that experience. We don't know how scarring or triggering that was. And if the goal is that they have to forgive you at the end of it, well, you've now centered yourself again. So we've got to go right back to the top of the list, right? So what can we do instead? So I've got what I'm calling the 5 R's of navigating mistakes. The first thing we need to do is recognize that we've made a mistake. Okay, sometimes, and I don't know if you've had this experience, something is coming out of my mouth and I know that it's the wrong thing, but I can't take it back because it's already going. So I've recognized myself already that there's a mistake that's happened. Okay, so I've already been aware. But sometimes we don't know that. Sometimes it takes somebody else pointing out that that mistake has happened. So we first have to recognize that a mistake was made. And then if somebody else is the one who has sort of called our attention to the fact that we've made that mistake, then we have to receive that feedback. And so often the automatic response when somebody gives that feedback is try to just disprove or distance ourselves from what they've just shared, that we're not actually hearing what we need to hear. And so remember this, feedback is a gift. We may not like the packaging that it comes in, but it is a gift nonetheless, okay? It gives us the information we need in order to do better. And then we have to respond, right? Because when we realize that we've made a mistake, how many people are like, I don't know who noticed that, but maybe if I just ignore the fact and just keep on trucking, maybe nobody will notice I just made that mistake, right? That's not going to do it. I will guarantee somebody's noticed, right? They may not have said it, but they've noticed. And even if they don't notice, you've noticed. And so part of our commitment to our personal integrity is how we lean into the opportunity to grow, right? So we have to respond. And what that response looks like is what I'm calling thank, apologize, and commit. Thank the person for the feedback if they've given. Thank is a bit optional depending on how you've discovered the mistake. But if somebody's raised the mistake to your attention, thank them for that feedback. Oh my gosh, thank you. I didn't even realize that. Or, I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. Apologize, not I'm sorry you were hurt by what I said, but I'm sorry that what I said hurt you, or I'm sorry I used the wrong pronouns. I'm really going to work on that. And commit, that piece is really important. What are you going to do differently? And it may be, I'm really going to work on that before we meet next, right? But make some sort of commitment to changing your behavior. Because if you say, I'm sorry, and you keep making the same mistake over and over again because you haven't actually invested in the learning you need to do not to make that mistake again, you're actually not really that sorry, right? Because you're not changing anything. And then you have to recover. So often this process becomes this activity of self-flagellation, right? I can't believe I did that. Oh my gosh, what does this person think of me? And we do ourselves real harm when we get stuck in mistakes. If we recognize that mistakes are part of life, it doesn't mean that we diminish the impact of the mistake, but we recognize it happens, it's gonna happen. What can I take away from this moment? And how do I keep going so that I'm not stuck in the moment in a way that both harms me and actually harms the other person too? Because when you get stuck in that place and keep replaying it, you're taking that person in that place with you oftentimes, right? And then finally, reflect. And this is really important if you keep making the same mistake over and over again, because that's really a sign that there's more work to be done. If you've met someone for the first time and you just learn their pronouns and you make a mistake, or somebody's changed their pronouns in your workplace and you make a mistake, okay, you may not have to reflect that deeply. It may just be a matter of practice. But it might be that before I come into my meeting with this person again, I'm going to say, all right, Paul's pronouns are now they, them. I'm used to, Paul and I worked together for 4 years. Paul has used he, him pronouns for 4 years, and now I'm changing gears. What do I have to do to make that connection of Paul and they pronouns so that I don't keep misgendering Paul in these meetings, right? So that may be the practice of Paul, they, them, Paul, they, them, and whatever you need to do, whether you need to write it out, but what is the work that you need to do to make it stick? But for some of that, it's going to be deeper than that, right? It may be examining biases that you're carrying or lessons that you've learned or things that you believe about folks that you have to unlearn. And that's really the work in that reflection that's really important. So those are my 5 quick but not at all easy steps in navigating mistakes. And so it's great, like if you think about them, what are the things that where are the places that I get stuck in this cycle, right? What are the things that I know that I have trouble with? For me, I have trouble recovering from mistakes, right? I feel so bad. I have such a high standard, particularly because I do this work. It's really hard for me to move past a mistake, but I have to figure out how to do it and I have to name it, because if I don't name it and model it as natural and something that's going to happen, then it becomes really hard for other people to lean into the space and do the same.
Nicole, I do have a question that was just submitted.
Yes.
Can you give a perspective on how to respond as the offended person, knowing that it's not my responsibility to forgive?
Can you say that again?
Yes, can you give a perspective on how to respond as the offended person, knowing that it's not their responsibility to forgive them? Right.
So I want to make a clarification here. That doesn't mean you can't forgive them. It doesn't mean that forgiveness is bad. I'm saying that if you are somebody who has made a mistake, if you've misgendered someone or made some other mistake or some other microaggression, you cannot expect forgiveness. If you get it, great. But if generally, if you receive the apology and you genuinely feel like, yeah, I want to forgive this person, great. Forgive them, great. That's what we all want, but it's not the obligation. It should not be the obligation. So what that looks like is if you are not in a place where you're able to forgive them, maybe this is the 50th time you've been misgendered today and you just don't have it in you to forgive one more person, or maybe this person has just been rude and disrespectful on an ongoing basis. You can just thank them. Thank you for your apology. That's it, right? Acknowledge that they apologize. But what I mean by forgiveness is like, it's okay. Don't worry about it. I know you don't mean it. Like all of those things that we do to make that person feel more comfortable, right? That may actually in the process make us feel less comfortable because now we're like, well, I do feel some kind of way about it. So it's not really okay. But you can just say, thanks for your apology and leave it at that. We don't have to be rude, right? But we don't have to fully engage in that process. I hope that's helpful. Okay. So, there we go. My computer is being very slow right now. Okay. So in the title, we talk about allyship, and allyship is a big concept. And allyship, I have entire sessions and trainings about allyship, but I want to go through it really quickly because I think allyship is a great way of entering into this space. Because we each have the opportunity, and I would add responsibility, but let's go with opportunity. We each have the opportunity to show up for each other, right? And if there's anything that I'm taking away from the last year, the last several years, our lifetimes is, we could all show up for each other more and the world would be a better place, right? So the definition of allyship, and you may have heard the term ally, I use allyship specifically because allyship to me, it's not about who we are, it's about what we do. So allyship to me is when we're using our privilege to challenge oppression against marginalized groups and individuals. It is a lifelong practice of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability. Really important. Allyship is not a label or an identity that is self-designated. I don't get to decide that, I'm a trans ally just because I think that trans people are A-okay, or that I think that trans people deserve rights, all of which is absolutely true. But that is not the definition of allyship. That is the definition of human decency, right? So how do we think about going one step further? So allyship is not about who you are or what you believe, it's about what you do, how you are engaging. So I have like 5, I try to do things in like really quick bites, not because life is in quick bites, but because it's how people sort of try to remember and hold on to things. So the first step in honing your allyship practice, and again, I have a whole long session about this, but I'm doing it really quickly, is we have to understand our privilege. And privilege is being used as sort of this word that people like feel like they have to be ashamed of. Privilege, we have privilege whether we want to have it or not. It is systemic, it is not personal, right? And because you work hard or have had experiences that are difficult, doesn't mean that there aren't privileges or there aren't that you don't have access to privilege by virtue of your identity, your belonging in certain identity groups. It just is. And it's not necessarily bad. What we do with our privilege is what makes it bad or good, right? Until we change systems that create privilege individually, how we show up, our best thing we can do is to understand where our privilege is and then use that to actually create spaces and opportunities for people who may not have privilege in those same areas. And that means we have to educate ourselves and we have to listen to each other and we have to believe what people are telling us, especially when that experience is different than our own. And when we are engaging in privilege, we have to be really mindful that we're not just sort of flipping the script and using our privilege for good in ways that still continue to marginalize or harm or dismiss other people. So it's really important that when we're engaging in allyship, we don't speak over people, we speak up, right? And we support and we take action with, not for. So it's not like, oh, I've got this I'm an ally, I'm committed, and now I'm going to walk in the room and sort of talk over all of the trans folks in the room or the other people of color in the room or because, but I'm doing it with them and for them and on their behalf. But that's not allyship. We really have to be thinking about how we are engaging in our own power dynamics. Again, this concept of mistakes, we have to take responsibilities for missteps. We have to be listening and learning and willing to engage in order to be in active allyship practice. And those four are really about allyship from an interpersonal perspective, right? Like, how do I show up in allyship as a person? The fifth piece is really about, as it relates to this notion of privilege, and we have systems. The ways that oppression and isms, racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and biphobia and all of those things show up, there is a measure of it that is interpersonal in how we connect with each other. But so much of that is about the systems that we're in. And until we change those systems, they're still going to drive all of the things that fuel the ways people are marginalized. So that piece around taking action to change systems is really important for a long-term, in a long-term view. And some of that becomes around and we'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like. But that is when we start to say, when people say allyship isn't enough, that's what they're talking about. It's not just enough to treat each other nicely. We have to address the systems that create the inequities to begin with. And the last thing, and this is a modified quote from activist Rachel Cargle, but allyship isn't about self-improvement or recognition. It doesn't end when you feel better. It ends when oppressed people are liberated. And what I mean by that, and I think we saw a lot of this over the summer with the racial uprisings, a lot of what we call virtue signaling, where people were saying things and posting things on social media, but not actually following through. And what happens is, if you're driven by trying to absolve one's own set of feeling of guilt or frustration, once you start feeling better, your investment starts to drop off. And that's not what we want to be the driver, right? We want to be invested in this because we are invested in everyone having rights and access and a sense of belonging and being able to live authentically. That's the goal. Any questions about allyship before we move into the last piece of our conversation?
Yes, Nicole, one thing that I've gotten is, can you be an ally and practice allyship without knowing someone within the LGBTQ community?
Yes and no. One of the definitions of allyship, the yes is the caveat, but one of the definitions of allyship that's really important is accountability, right? We cannot be allies to a community with which we don't have any connection, understanding, engagement. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't still care and shouldn't still do things, but by my definition of allyship, you need to do more. And I would say the question is, why don't I? Right? What has been the obstacle? Why don't I, in my circle of friends, if I care about this community, what is the thing? We're everywhere, right? So what is happening that I actually don't have connection and real meaningful connection to someone who's LGBTQ? And I ask that question not to be, self-flagellating, like I'm a bad person. But if you are committed to allyship, that's real for you, that's the question I would ask. And so it might be, well, because I'm still moving, like because the places that I go to church or the places that I go to work or the places that I hang out don't have a big community. So what that might mean is it may be a good time to change the places you go to work or go to church or where like hang out. Or how do I not know? Maybe it's just that you don't know, right? So what is it? How can I show up in a way that makes it comfortable and safe for people to actually disclose or let me know or bring me into some of the elements of their personal world that it's like, oh my goodness, I do have friends. And it's really important not to tokenize people, because even if you have somebody in that community, it's like that whole thing, the frustration is like, I can't be racist because I have a Black friend, right? That's like the notion that any married man can't be sexist, right? Our behaviors and who we engage with are not always in alignment. It takes constant work on ourselves in interrogating, what have we learned? What haven't we learned? How is that influencing the people that we hold close to us? And we have to do that work for ourselves. So the reason that I say no is because that accountability piece is missing. But the reason I say yes is because you're on the right track, and I don't want it to be like, oh, well, I haven't met all the criteria of allyship, so I'm going to check out. No, this should be the thing that is like, I am committed to this. What do I need to do to keep going? Any other questions? That's a good one. And I'm being, more literal in the definition there, right? Like we're saying what allyship practice if you're really engaged in an allyship practice. But there are all sorts of ways that we can be supportive, and if you're not at that place yet, keep going. Build on that commitment, build on that drive, build on that desire, build on those beliefs, and now put action behind it. Okay. So we're now at the part where anyone who's type A or anyone who really wants to be like, no, that's great. Thanks for all this information. Now, what do I do when I leave this session? Right? This is hopefully where I'm going to give you a little something to hold on to. So often, we think about like, but we're inclusive, aren't we? Right? I don't hear anybody using slurs or disparaging remarks or, generally, I think we're an inclusive environment. One of the things that I want to share are all of the ways that our implicit bias shows up, which is actually probably a bigger driver in the ways that we're building inclusion than overt sort of malice is, right? So this is a slide from a publication that HRC puts out where we have done a survey and examined sort of workplace environments. And this is sort of the purple data is for LGBT employees. And I'm assuming that there's no Q here just because that wasn't the way it was defined in the study, versus non-LGBT employees. And so this is the way that things that are part of our daily life that are entirely connected to our gender identity and sexual orientation show up, right? These getting to know you topics that happen around the water cooler, or remember those when we actually used to be in person and there were water coolers, and but all of the ways that we just in casual conversation come up, how we talk about our children, how we talk about our spouses and relationships and dating, how we talk about our social lives, what we do on the weekends, where we go, what TV shows or movies we watch, which celebrities we really like, right? Oftentimes, these are really influenced and tied, not exclusively, but in meaningful ways to our sexual orientation and gender identity. So imagine if we're in a work environment and we don't feel comfortable or feel safe talking about naming our spouse or naming that we're dating somebody of the same gender, talking about our past because we transitioned at some point, talking about what we're doing for the weekend because we're going somewhere that is like really, known as being an LGBTQ hangout. And if I'm going there, I'm going to out myself in a way that doesn't feel comfortable. And it doesn't have to be active disparagement. That's the response. There's that quiet discomfort that's like, oh, cool. I don't know what to say. Like, and the thing is, like, I don't know what to say to that. I don't know how to relate to that. I don't know how to engage with you after that information is shared. That makes people feel like, okay, won't do that again, right? There are still so many places where people don't feel comfortable putting pictures of their family on their desk because they will experience discrimination or marginalization or just distancing or that passive aggressive kind of awkwardness or microaggressions, right? So it's really important that when we think about our inclusive environments, we're not just thinking about the ways that we are overtly being exclusive, but what are our micro affirmations? We hear about microaggressions. Micro affirmations are all of those ways that we give subtle cues and messages of being welcoming or celebratory or engaging. And that's this. So when we're talking about taking action, there are a few things that I want us to think about. There are different ways that we can take action. And one of the ways is around how do I interrogate my beliefs or knowledge? So how can I take action on an individual level, which is saying, what do I know? What don't I know? Where do I get my sources of information? Who do I follow on Twitter? What books have I read lately? How am I getting my information? What TV shows am I watching, right? All of those are really important cues, and we can stay in our comfort bubble by continuing to replicate the same things we're used to. So there's an opportunity there to branch out, follow some additional influencers on Twitter or Instagram that are, not folks that you have often followed, to get a different perspective. And then the next place is my interpersonal interactions. Who's in my networks? Who's close to me? Who do I connect to? It goes back to that question, I'm realizing I actually don't have any LGBTQ friends. Now, the goal is not to go out and to find that LGBTQ friend to have them. But the goal is to think about how do I change the ways that I'm engaging in my community so that I actually create the opportunity to be exposed and connect to and organically meet and build relationship with LGBTQ people. And then what are my areas of influence? And this is where it's institutional, right? Think about your organizations. What are your policies? What are your practices? What are the ways that you are creating environments for your team if you manage a team? Those are those institutional areas of influence that you can start to explore and think about them through the lens of how can these become more inclusive? And then finally, it's around our advocacy. That's the political and systemic stuff. So who are the candidates that I'm supporting? What are the bills or the legislation? And that can be on a civic engagement basis. So much of the work that's happening around creating LGBTQ inclusion and or discrimination is happening on local levels. It's happening in school boards, right? It's happening in municipalities. It's not just a federal election. There are a lot of ways that politically we can be engaged in shaping policies and practices in our political systems that create more inclusion. But at the end of the day, we really have to stay curious, and we have to stay intentional, and we have to stay invested. And that takes constant we have to remind ourselves of that, because it becomes really easy to slip back into our comfortable spaces, right? Where we're not necessarily exploring these things. So finally, before we do a little exercise, I want to talk about a few tips that I want you to take away from this conversation. So hold that sense of what these spaces, my beliefs, my interactions, my areas of influence, and my advocacy. And here are a few tips specifically. One, choose your language with intention. So often we use language in ways that we haven't fully interrogated the words or phrases that we use. How many times have you heard, oh, that's so gay? Like, where does that come from? How do we think about what the meaning is behind the words that we use and how that can actually send messages to the people around us? Also, the ways that we create inclusion with our language. We talked about pronoun usage in our email signatures, but also as we address a group of people, ladies and gentlemen, right? Very gendered, very binary language. How about, hey folks, hey friends, welcome. You know, how are we using our language in different ways? How do we try to stay aware of language changes that may be unintentionally offensive to people or unintentionally hurtful to people, and stay attuned to that. And sometimes the way we learn is we say it and somebody tells us, we don't do that. But, you know, and I think it goes without saying, we don't use intentionally derogatory or offensive terms. And I think that is really important in workplaces, even if you think that there's nobody who's LGBTQ identified, because that again goes back to the place, what kind of environment are we creating to welcome in other folks? Challenge your assumptions. It's really important. We make all sorts of assumptions, but hey, I see that you're partnered with a man, so you must be straight. Here's a woman identified person who's partnered with a man, they must be straight. Not necessarily, right? Here's a person who's female presenting, female identified, they must be cisgender. Not necessarily, right? Here's somebody who I think is pretty masculine identified, I'm going to use he, him pronouns. Not necessarily, right? If there is anything to take away, the answer is not necessarily. So how do we challenge our assumptions and stay open to things not being the way we are necessarily fully perceiving them? And we have to prioritize respect over agreeing and understanding. At the end of the day, all of this is about respect. We are not going to agree on everything. We are not going to fundamentally change our beliefs and challenge the sort of foundational things. Eventually, I hope we are all on a journey to try to challenge the ways that we have learned things that are actually not helpful, are not supportive, are not in support of people's authentic identity and living their truth and being equal and, you know, in opposition to justice. But at the very least, while you're doing that work, we have to start with respect. And we don't have to agree and we don't have to understand in order to do that. And finally, it's important to speak up when you see or hear something inappropriate or exclusionary. So this work isn't just about the ways that I am sort of interrogating myself, but how am I, again, engaging other people? And that doesn't mean making people feel bad or making them feel like throwing them out on the carpet when they say something, but it's like, you know, hey, we really don't use that terminology, or, you know, that actually may be offensive to someone, or that may not be welcoming or affirming of folks in the community who are part of our community. There are perfectly friendly and respectful ways of calling people in and sort of educating them. And we have a responsibility to do that, especially if we are coming from a place of privilege, especially if it's not about our identity. Because if we don't, it means that the people who are already marginalized are having to do that work. And I would say it's a lot of work. And if every time I go into a space, I have to be the one responsible for educating people about LGBTQ identity and educating people about Black identity and educating people about female identity and all of the ways that I carry marginalized identities, like, I'm just not going to come, right? Because that's just too much work. And it shouldn't be my responsibility. If you want me here, you do the work, right? So now it's your turn. I've just talked at you for a long time. And I want you to leave here with knowledge, yes, but I want you to leave here with a commitment to action too. Because action without knowledge is folly. I don't want you moving through the world doing stuff without having a good knowledge base. But if you have knowledge and you don't act, it's futile, right? Then the last 80 minutes we spent together isn't worth anything. So we're going to actually put you in small groups of about 5 people. So you can't really hide, but you get a chance to chat with each other a little more. And I want you to talk about these three things. What is one area in your workplace that there's an opportunity to increase inclusion for LGBTQ colleagues? That doesn't mean you have to say, oh, we're terrible at this and our policies are that. Like, it can be small ways, it can be in larger ways, but what's one area? What's one thing you can identify? The second question I want you to talk about is what's one area that you have influence, that you can take action, where you can take action? Because it's all great to point out things that are wrong, right? But somebody's got to be willing to take the initiative to address them. So what's a place that you have the power and influence to take initiative? And the answer is not no place, because no matter what your role is in your organization, you have a sphere of influence, even if it's just with your friends. And so out of that, I want you to come away with one action you can commit doing in your workplace, with your team, with the company broader, whatever it is. But what is one thing that you can commit to doing? And that could just be like, hey, I want to see what kind of inclusion policies we have. Not something I looked at before. How do I do that? Now I've taken that off the table, so I'm not going to make it easy. You can find something else, or you can have that and something else. But I want you to really think about that. So we're going to put you in these rooms. We'll have about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and close.
Welcome back, everyone, from that lovely breakout. I hope that your conversation was as engaging as mine. Thank you to my group. That was wonderful. I really appreciated the conversation and the ideas of and the sharing of what you're already doing and some of the things that we can be doing as we move forward. Nicole, whenever you're back in the room, I will throw it to you if you have any closing remarks. And thank you so much for this time with us. I cannot, from the bottom of my heart, it just speaks to me, and I hope that it speaks to everyone else in this session and how to move forward in this space as we practice allyship and understand better everything that we can do to make this one big community.
Thank you. And I want to thank Vanessa and Virginia for a great conversation. You know, one of the things, and I will just, in the 2 minutes we have left, I know that I threw a lot at you. The goal is not to have you digest all of it in one bite. You know, they say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. But the goal is to give you some sort of framework and then inspire you or motivate you then to sort of delve deeper and learn more in the places that you can, and that you actually take the time and energy to do that, right? That's an important way of showing up. The other thing is, you know, the central core message of respect, that we are building respect, we're building community, and if nothing else, we need to ask people how they need us to show up and show up for them. And sometimes that means asking people outside and then build the environment inside that allows us to show up proactively, right? And so I hope that no matter where you are in your knowledge or your journey, that you got something out of our conversation today. My desire for you is to continue on the journey. This is one small step. Please keep showing up. And I will say, as somebody who's LGBTQ identified and doing this work day in and day out, we need you. Please don't let the sense that you know, same-sex marriage is the law of the land make you feel that we have done the work that we need to do. We are working actively to pass the Equality Act because people can still be fired. Well, no, not because of Bostock. Fortunately, we've just got that, so people can't be fired, but people can still be denied housing, and there are other ways that LGBTQ people are not being sort of recognized and created and have an opportunity to just live our best lives just like everyone else. So please keep showing up. Please keep showing up for your LGBTQ colleagues, those who are visible and those who are not visible. And thank you so much for choosing to be in this session and taking the time out to be here today. I really, really appreciate your time and attention. And thanks to Kate and Samuel and the whole team. It's been a wonderful experience to do this with you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's been a true pleasure. Everyone, this session will be made available on the EAMC website, as well as listed on Facebook after the session recording goes live. If you have any other questions that you'd like to submit to us, please feel free to send them to the link submitted in that email that was sent out to you at the session, and we will be happy to address them after the fact. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.